I'm 71 years old, and until recently, I thought I knew what my life would look like until the very end. For 43 years, I was the kind of wife people called traditional. I cooked every meal, folded every shirt, and smiled through things that should have broken me. My name is Ellen, and what I'm about to share with you began on what should have been just another Tuesday night. I spent most of that afternoon in the kitchen, making Hank's favorite beef short ribs with garlic mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade biscuits. I'd even set the table with our wedding china, the same set I picked out when I was 28, and thought love looked like perfect plates and crisp linen napkins. I still believed that a well-set table could make someone feel appreciated. Hank didn't notice. He walked into the dining room with his usual grunt, cracked open a beer, and sat down without a word. Our daughter-in-law Megan arrived with her 15-year-old Emily about 10 minutes later. Megan let herself in. She hadn't knocked in years. She glanced at the table and said, "I didn't need to go through all this trouble." But her tone wasn't grateful. It was that careful kind of judgment that looks like politeness. Emily didn't even look up from her phone. She mumbled something that might have been high and slumped into her chair like being there was a punishment. Dinner started like so many before. Hank complained that the meat was dry, the beans were cold. Why did I always serve too many dishes? Megan launched into a monologue about her latest marketing campaign while tossing in subtle digs at my old-fashioned ways. Emily scrolled on her phone, snickering every now and then at something I couldn't see. I tried to contribute. I asked questions, smiled where I was supposed to, and pretended I hadn't heard Megan tell Emily last year that grandmothers like me try too hard to stay relevant. But I kept trying, because I still thought if I played the part right, I'd feel like part of the family. Hank reached for his second beer before I even sat down. By the time I took my first bite, the conversation had turned into a three-person show. I was the audience. No one asked me anything. No one looked at me unless it was to criticize or condescend. At one point, Emily laughed out loud at something on her phone. Megan leaned over to look, and then they both burst out laughing. Hank joined in without even knowing why. I tried just one more time to be part of the moment. "What's so funny?" I asked, hoping for a sliver of connection. That's when Hank turned toward me with a face I'll never forget. Not angry, just tired of me. Like I was a wall that talked too much. "Ellen, you wouldn't get it. It's a generational thing." Megan nodded. "Some things just don't translate across age gaps," she said, like I was a textbook in a language no one wanted to read. Something inside me cracked. Not all at once. Just a slow splitting of everything I'd kept glued together for decades. I said maybe they should try me. Maybe I'd surprise them. Hank looked annoyed. He picked up his wine glass. I had chosen that bottle an expensive Cabernet to make dinner feel like a celebration. "You want to know what's funny?" he said. "Watching you pretend you have anything to contribute." And then with a flick of his wrist, he poured the entire glass over my head. The wine soaked my hair. It dripped down my cheeks onto the cream blouse I had chosen because he once said it made me look elegant. Silence for 3 full seconds. Then Megan burst into laughter loud and sharp. Emily followed her giggle, mixing with her mother's. Hank chuckled too, like the moment was all in good fun. I sat there feeling every one of my 71 years settle into my spine. I didn't say a word. I wiped my face with my napkin, placed it next to my plate, and stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, the same floor I had refinished myself back in 1991. Megan laughed again. "Oh my God, Ellen, you should see your face." I walked to the hallway, grabbed my purse, and left through the front door. No one stopped me. No one called my name. I walked past the garden I'd planted and the mailbox I'd painted by hand. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't look back. That night, something shifted in me that I hadn't known still had room to move. Something that had waited quietly beneath layers of compromise and apology and silence. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but for the first time in decades, I knew I wasn't going back. Not like that. I sat in my car outside a grocery store, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I meant to. The engine was off, but I hadn't moved in 15 minutes. My blouse still clung to my skin, sticky with dried wine. The smell of it filled the car, rich and sour and humiliating. I wasn't crying. I was just sitting, trying to understand how I had ended up in a world where the people I loved could laugh at my pain like it was a joke. Then my phone rang. It was Hank. I hesitated. I thought maybe he was calling to say he was sorry, that something about the look on my face had shaken something loose in him, but his voice wasn't apologetic. It was rushed nervous. He said there were 3 men at the house asking for me, lawyers wearing suits. They said they needed to speak to me about the house. I asked what kind of lawyers. He didn't know. They had documents and folders and looked serious. His voice was climbing. Something about their tone had spooked him. I drove back without saying much, just told him not to let them leave. I wasn't afraid. Not exactly. Just numb. Curious, maybe, like the numbness was making room for something else. I couldn't imagine why any lawyer would show up asking for me. Hank had always handled everything legal. I just signed papers when he told me to. When I pulled into the driveway, the black sedan in front of our house looked out of place. Too sleek, too formal. Inside, through the living room window, I could see Hank pacing like a caged animal. He looked like a man used to being in control and suddenly unsure if the walls were still his. I stepped into the house. The men stood as I entered. The oldest of them, with silver hair and a quiet confidence, introduced himself as Mr. Whitaker from a law firm in Chicago. He said their firm had represented my parents' estate back in 1979. My breath caught. I hadn't heard that name in decades. Mr. Whitaker explained they had instructions to contact me under specific conditions. Those conditions, he said, had been met when someone attempted to modify the ownership records of our property. I glanced at Hank. He was suddenly very interested in the floor. Mr. Whitaker opened a folder and showed me a copy of the original deed. My name, Ellen Marie Carson. Not Hank's. Not both of ours. Just mine. I stared at it, not understanding what I was seeing. He explained it slowly, like he'd done this kind of thing before. After my parents died, I inherited the house I grew up in and a substantial sum of money. I'd barely remembered that. The grief had swallowed everything. Hank had taken care of it all, handling the sale, the bank transfers, everything. I had signed what he told me to sign. Apparently, my parents had been very clear. They wanted their daughter to own whatever came from their estate independently. They had instructed the lawyers to ensure that any property bought with the proceeds from the inheritance be listed solely in my name. And that was what they had done back in 1980 when Hank and I bought this house. I looked up from the folder and met Hank's eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even confused. He looked shaken. For 43 years, he had believed this house was his, that he was the provider, the head of the household, the one who called the shots. But the truth had been sitting under his roof the entire time. The house was mine. I didn't know how to process it, not fully. My name on legal papers I hadn't seen in decades. My ownership written in ink before I even knew what to do with such power. For so long, I thought I was lucky just to have a place at the table. I didn't know I'd owned the table itself. The shift was quiet but seismic. Something old and buried inside me began to stir. I had spent my entire adult life deferring, accommodating, shrinking. And yet, somehow, I had been the one with the title, the one with the authority, the one with the house. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to know what else I might still own, not just in paperwork, but in my life. Mr. Whitaker asked if we could sit down for a moment. His voice had softened, and there was something almost reverent in the way he handled the folder in his hands. He said there was one more thing my parents had left behind, something meant only for me. He pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with time. My mother's handwriting was on the front. It read, "For Ellen, to be opened only if she ever feels disrespected in her own home." I didn't speak. I just stared at those words, small and neat, written by hands that had once braided my hair and pressed cool cloths to my feverish forehead. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a clause my parents had included in the trust. They called it the dignity clause. If at any point I felt unsafe, belittled, or disrespected in the home purchased with their inheritance, I had the legal right to immediate and exclusive possession. Anyone else living there would have 30 days to leave. No court battle, no negotiation. Just a door I could finally close if I ever needed to. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even realize I was crying until a tear hit the back of my hand. They had known. Somehow, long before my life unfolded, they had anticipated that I might one day need this. My parents, gone before I turned 30, had still found a way to protect me, to give me a tool I hadn't even known I was holding. They had seen something in the world that made them worry for their daughter's place in it. And they'd done what good parents do. They planned for a moment when I might forget my worth. Hank tried to laugh it off, said it sounded dramatic, that I was being sensitive. But I couldn't hear him anymore. All I could think about was the way my father used to call me his firecracker, how my mother always told me I had a voice that mattered. I had spent decades muting that voice, folding myself into someone else's story. Now I held the proof that I had always been the one holding the pen. I stood in the center of the living room, the envelope still in my hand, and looked at the people I had once called family. Hank was pacing again, his hands in his pockets, trying to mask the growing panic on his face. Lisa stood frozen near the hallway, arms crossed but jaw tight, like she was bracing for impact. Katie, for once, had put her phone away. I cleared my throat. My voice didn't shake. I'd like to invoke the dignity clause. Lisa blinked, like she hadn't heard me correctly. What clause? She asked, stepping closer. I held up the document. The one that gives me full control of this house. The one that says anyone who disrespects me has 30 days to leave. Hank laughed, but it cracked halfway through. Ellen, come on. Let's be reasonable. We had a rough dinner. It happens. We're family. You don't throw your family out over a little misunderstanding. Lisa jumped in. This is your home too, Hank. Ellen, you can't be serious. Where would we go? How would we explain this to Emily's school? You're upset right now. You're making an emotional decision. I looked at her, really looked. For years, she had spoken over me, around me, through me. This was the first time she looked uncertain. The first time she didn't know what to say to put me back in my place. Hank's voice softened. Ellen, please. I've made mistakes. I know that. But we've built a life here. We raised Michael here. We grew old here. Doesn't that count for something? I took a breath, long and steady. Then I said it. No, Hank. This is my house. It always has been. The room fell silent. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. They didn't know what to say. And I didn't owe them anything more. I had spent 43 years making space for other people. Tonight I reclaimed it, all of it. It didn't take long for them to regroup. A few days after I invoked the dignity clause, I received a notice from the county court. Hank and Lisa had filed a petition questioning my mental capacity. They claimed I was showing signs of cognitive decline, making irrational decisions, and needed a legal guardian to manage my affairs. It was a coordinated attack dressed up as concern. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted to control me, again. But this time, I didn't sit quietly. I had the right to choose who evaluated me, and I wasn't about to let some court-appointed stranger decide my future. With the help of Mr. Whitaker, I found Dr. Samuel Becker, a retired psychiatrist known for his integrity and his unwillingness to be manipulated by family drama. He was 78, sharp as a scalpel, and had no patience for people who confused money with authority. Our first meeting took place in his office, lined with worn leather books and framed photographs of his grandchildren. He greeted me warmly, offered tea, and said he'd reviewed the petition. Then he said something that stayed with me. It's interesting how often families become concerned about a woman's mental health right after she discovers she owns something valuable. The evaluation was thorough. Over several hours, he tested my memory, reasoning, judgment, and comprehension. He asked me to walk him through the events of the past month in detail. He had me read legal documents and explain their implications. We talked about finances, inheritance law, and long-term planning. I answered every question calmly, clearly, without apology. At the end of the session, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mrs. Carson, not only are you of sound mind, but you're showing a stronger grasp of your rights than most people half your age." I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been held tight for decades. But he wasn't done. He told me that the behavior I had described being excluded from financial decisions, being mocked, ignored, and manipulated, was a textbook case of long-term emotional and financial abuse. Abuse. I had never used that word before. I had reserved it for bruises and screaming matches, not for silence, not for the constant erosion of confidence and self-worth. But now, hearing it from a professional, it fits. He said the pattern was clear. I had been convinced for years that I wasn't capable, that I couldn't handle numbers or contracts or independence, that I should be grateful just to be cared for. But what I had really been was controlled. The final report he filed with the court was concise and devastating. I was fully competent, fully capable, and fully aware. The petition was dismissed before it ever reached a hearing. Mr. Whitaker called to give me the news. His voice carried a note of quiet pride. "They tried to silence you, but you were louder." I didn't celebrate with champagne or confetti. I went for a walk, past the mailbox I'd painted, past the garden beds I had planted myself. I let the wind tangle my hair and thought about how long it had taken me to believe I had a right to be heard. They had tried to turn the law against me. But the truth, once spoken clearly and without fear, was a kind of justice, all its own. The day after Dr. Becker's report cleared me, I changed the locks. It was a small act, but it felt enormous. For the first time in decades, I was the only person with a key to my house. No one could walk in without my say-so. The silence after the locksmith left wasn't lonely. It was clean, empty in the best way. I stood in the hallway and stared at the faded beige walls, the same color Hank had insisted on back in 1994. He called it practical. I had called it lifeless, but I'd never argued. I didn't just want the locks to change. I wanted everything to change. At the paint store, I told the young woman behind the counter I was repainting every room. She asked what kind of feel I was going for. I said I wanted the kitchen to feel like morning light, the living room like the ocean, and the bedroom like a garden after rain. She smiled and handed me swatches. I chose each color without asking for anyone's opinion. For 3 weeks, I worked alongside a pair of cheerful painters and did the detail work myself. The aches in my back and hands didn't bother me. Every brushstroke felt like peeling away someone else's version of me. I turned the guest room into an office. Not a cozy corner, but a real space. A desk, a bookshelf, and a laptop I'd picked out myself. I signed up for online courses in estate law and personal finance. I was 71 and just getting started. They came back, of course. Lisa first all smiles and softened tones. She said the family wanted to talk things out. Then Hank, calling from a borrowed number, said maybe we had all been too harsh. Then Michael, my son, flew in from Seattle. He stood in the doorway looking older than I remembered, carrying the weight of someone stuck between his wife's expectations and his mother's awakening. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" We sat in the office, the one that used to be a room for guests. He glanced at the textbooks at the legal pad filled with my notes. "You've really been studying." I nodded. I needed to understand what I'd missed for so long. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up. I should have seen it." I didn't know what to say back, so I just put my hand over his and squeezed. Katie came the next day. She wasn't holding her phone for once. She wandered through the rooms like she was seeing them for the first time. "Grandma, you painted everything. It's beautiful." "You did this all by yourself." I told her I'd had help, but the choices were mine. Every one of them. Later over tea, she said she didn't understand everything that had happened, but she wanted to visit more often. I said she was welcome as long as she understood the rule: anyone who comes into this house has to treat me with respect. She nodded. I can do that. I didn't rebuild the same house. I built a new one from the bones of the old. And I didn't open the door to everyone, only those who had earned it. In the months that followed, I kept going. I finished my online course in estate planning and enrolled in 2 more financial literacy and real estate law. I set alarms on my phone for study time and wrote notes in the margins like I was back in college. Sometimes I forgot I was 71. Other times I remembered and smiled anyway. I started planning a trip to Italy, something I had dreamed about for years. I kept putting it off because Hank didn't like to fly and said Europe was a waste of money. But now I was free to decide for myself. I had a travel agent print brochures and I left them on my kitchen table just because I liked looking at them. Most mornings I sat on the front porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the garden. I had planted those flowers for decades, but now I actually saw them. I knew their names. I chose which ones stayed and which ones I replaced. One afternoon, the phone rang. Hank's name lit up the screen. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. Hi, Ellen, he said. His voice was softer than I remembered. Michael said you're doing well. I am, I said. He was quiet for a second. I was wondering if maybe we could be friends. Not right away, but someday. I don't want things to end angrily. I looked out at the tulips swaying in the breeze. I thought about the house behind me, every wall finally painted the color I wanted. I thought about the quiet, the peace, the sense of space that didn't ask me to shrink anymore. I don't hate you, Hank. But I can't go back to living your life. I'm finally living mine. He didn't argue, just said he understood. Then we said goodbye. When the call ended, I sat on the porch a while longer. No noise, no pressure, no compromise. Just me. Alive, alert, and exactly where I was supposed to be.